Okay guys, so here is finally the video for Macbeth as promised. So we'll start off talking about Macbeth himself, and then we will move to talk about Lady Macbeth. Okay, so we're going to start with himself, okay, the eponymous character. At the start of the play, Macbeth is a hugely popular character. He's highly respected. He defeats Duncan's enemies. He saves Scotland. The irony. Duncan rewards him for his loyalty. He says that what the Thane of Cawdor has lost, Macbeth hath won. Never more shall the Thane of Cawdor deceive our bosom interest. So the foundations of the state are on loyalty and honesty and protection. And Macbeth highlights all of these and follows all these values carefully. So he's close to Lady Macbeth at the start of the play. They're genuine partners in greatness. The murder of Duncan cuts Macbeth off from civilised society and drives a wedge between him and Lady Macbeth. And a lot of you outlined that in the conversations and discussions that we've had recently. So as the play unfolds, he becomes more and more isolated. He becomes more and more removed from the norms, the social norms that he's used to. He goes from being a highly regarded soldier, oh brave Macbeth, well he deserves that name, Bellona's bridegroom, to an absolutely despised tyrant. So he's a highly isolated character by the end of the play. He is the cancer of the body politic that must be removed in order to return Scotland to full health. The killing of Duncan, or through the killing of Duncan, Macbeth violates blatantly the laws of the gods and the laws of man. He knows the murder of this good king is against the use of nature. He says that. Why does my heart beat, knock against my ribs against the use of nature? But by knowingly breaking the natural bonds that bind society together, Macbeth disrupts the natural law and order of Scotland. And that's reflected in Shakespeare's use of pathetic fallacy throughout the play. When Ross and Lennox talk about Duncan's horses eating each other, the storm, the porter talks about the storm and the weather. Okay, so that's telling us that all is not as it seems, or that things are going badly in Scotland. So the other characters are suspicious of Macbeth's behaviour. Malcolm and Donablain flee because there's daggers in men's smiles. So the loyalty with which Duncan has founded the state, or the natural order of loyalty that existed at the start of the play, has now vanished. Malcolm and Donablain flee because they're worried that they can't trust anyone. Macduff refuses to go to Scone to see Macbeth crowned. Banquo suspects that he played most foully for the crown. So there are those around Macbeth who know or certainly suspect that he has done something wrong. While Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are initially united, they are driven by a shared sense of guilt. They become isolated from each other, and at one point Lady Macbeth has to make an appointment to see him. She asks a servant to ask the king, is it possible for them to have an appointment, to have a meeting, to have a conversation? And this is not the way we have seen these characters interact with each other previously. Macbeth doesn't share his plans with her. He doesn't share his plans for kingship going forward. He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't, when she says what's to be done, he says, be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck. So he isolates her from the plans and from any ideas he has in terms of preparation for the kingship. She is an important aid for him during the banquet, however, and she proves her worth in that way, that she keeps the Thanes in order or in line, and she tells him that it's a fit, that it's something that happens to him every now and then, and when Macbeth refuses to come out of it, or when he refuses to come sane again, and she says, stand not upon the order of your going, but go at once, so she gives the orders for them to leave. So she does assert her dominance and her power then, for sure. But she moves from being this dearest partner in greatness to a passive peripheral character. That is the last we see of her at the banquet scene. As Macbeth becomes even more isolated from those around him, Lady Macbeth vanishes into the shadows. She disappears as a character completely. So any sort of support base or structure, scaffolding that Macbeth would have had is gone. So having usurped the crown, Macbeth finds himself in a position where he can't trust anyone. And he says that at the very start. He says that if I've taken the crown in this way, there's every chance that someone might do that for me as well. And that's important. He recognizes that what he's doing is wrong and that it could be done onto him as well. So everything he does in the main body of the play is about protection and protecting and maintaining his power. So he cannot rely on the loyalty of those around him. And again, this idea of loyalty and that he's in a position he shouldn't be in against the natural order of things. This idea of borrowed robes. Why do you address me in borrowed robes? So Shakespeare uses a lot of clothing imagery and symbolism to help support this idea that Macbeth is not in the position he should be in. Malcolm and Lady Macduff both mention the terrible state of Scotland once Macbeth has taken power. Lady Macduff bemoans, "Be cruel the times," she says. And ironically, just before Macbeth attacks her castle, she talks about what a terrible state of fear the citizens of Scotland are in. And once he attacks the castle and slaughters everyone inside, the other characters are left to break the news to Macduff, and they talk about poor Scotland, bloody Scotland. And this act that he commits against Lady Macduff and her family shows how far removed he is from any sort of moral boundary, that he's so far from it, the line is a dot to him now. And he has gone so far, he says it himself, "I'm in blood steps so far that to go forward would be as tedious as to go back." So he has jumped the life to come. He has murdered sleep, so he may as well keep going and be hung for a sheep as a lamb, I suppose. But the attack on Macduff's castle is the opposite from the timid murder of Duncan. He's so reluctant to murder Duncan. He recognises how wrong it is. He knows that it's the wrong thing to do. And he hallucinates this dagger before him. Is this a dagger I see before me? But the act of savagery that the rape of Lady Macduff's castle is highlights his total moral breakdown and his lack of conscience. So Macduff describes Macbeth as a bloody, sceptred tyrant. And blood is mentioned something like 146 times in the play. It's mentioned a lot. It's a very strong image, a very strong symbol of deceit, of destruction, of deception in the play. And all of this is juxtaposed against the healing power of King Edward. Okay, so when we talk about kingship and what kings should do and how they should behave, and this King Edward is a healer, and he's a good king, and everything that Macbeth isn't. So he's juxtaposed against the destructive powers of Macbeth. And Malcolm lists his king becoming graces that show what the expectations of the role of king is. And this is telling us as an audience, Shakespeare is telling us what the expectations are and how far Macbeth is from them. That he doesn't match any of these king becoming graces, that he's full of vice, not virtue. And that Macbeth is the absolute opposite of everything that we have come to expect of a king, or what we should expect of a king. Okay, so we're going to talk about Lady Macbeth now. So these are some of the notes that we have been talking about in class, some of the discussions. So I've just made a note of some of them here. So Lady Macbeth involves the forces of evil to possess her, to unsex her without ever thinking of the consequences of her actions. And we've spoken a lot about, is she really a woman of limited imagination, considering how quick thinking she is and how creative she is in dealing with some of the sticky situations she finds herself in with Macbeth. At the banquet scene, she talks about how it's a fit, how it's almost like an epileptic fit that he has. When the murder of Duncan is first discovered, and Macbeth is just over the top in his response to it. Had I lived a moment more or a moment less, when he talks about that, and she fakes a faint in order to take the attention away from Macbeth because he's being too obvious. So I don't know if it's fair to argue that she's a woman of a limited imagination. But she never thinks about consequences. She's impulsive, she's reactionary, she doesn't think long term. We can, of course, argue that she can't begin to imagine what Macbeth will turn into, how tyrannical and dictatorial he will become. And that she thinks, maybe simplistically, that it will be a fairy tale. She will become queen, he will be king, and they lived happily ever after. That she doesn't begin to imagine what possible dangers could lie before them and how it could impact on their relationship. The fact that she calls on the spirits also highlights that she's not as evil, that she needs to call on dark spirits in order to be the worst version of herself. And Macbeth needs to be told by the witches how ambitious he is. And that's some food for thought there too. The very action of her calling on the spirits provides some evidence that she's not entirely evil. And I know some of you will disagree with that. She is a focus-driven character for sure, who's prepared to do anything to see her husband on the throne, and by proxy on the throne herself. Her single-mindedness, and I think maybe this is perhaps her greatest flaw, she has tunnel vision. She is completely focused on one goal. It's both her greatest strength and her biggest weakness. It enables her to go through and with a plan, to come up with a plan and go through with it. But it also allows her to completely destabilise, destroys her inner peace, and completely brings about her own personal destruction. When she's met with Macbeth's reluctance, she never for a second questions why he wouldn't do it. When he talks about, we jump at life to come and he's been kind to me lately and he's my kinsman, I should, against the murderer, bar the door, not bear the knife myself. She doesn't question, she doesn't think about it. She says, are you a man? Art thou afraid to be in thine own act as thou art in valour? So she questions him, she manipulates him, goads him into action. She emotionally blackmails him, calls him a coward, questions his manhood, challenges him, taps into and pushes all the right buttons to goad him into acting. It takes her 50 lines for him. It takes her 50 lines to persuade him to commit the murder, despite his long soliloquy outlining why he wouldn't do it. And if chance may crown me without my stir, is his final word. And he says, we shall proceed no further in this business. 50 lines later, he's set up to murder the king. The plan to murder Duncan is simple. It's unimaginative. So it highlights how naive she is. The plan is absurd, really, when you think about it. The idea that Duncan will be murdered by his grooms who got too drunk is ridiculous. But yet, that is the plan that Macbeth signs up to anyway. Again, showing how manipulated he is, or how much he trusts her, how like a team they are. Her childlike and naive approach is further evident in her behaviour after the event. The idea that suggesting a little water clears us of this deed is bizarre. That you can just wash the blood from your hands and never think of it again is ridiculous. So she is completely naive, and she doesn't think that there could be any consequences to regicide. She also appears not to understand why Macbeth might be troubled by the murder. She scolds him for it. Consider it not so deeply. When she makes the appointment with him to see him after he's king, she says, you spend too much time on your own thinking about things. So she's always scolding him for thinking too much. Lady Macbeth is realistic. She's pragmatic. She's logical. She responds quickly in a crisis. The fainting, the banquet scene. She's not a deep thinker. She cannot comprehend Macbeth's behaviour after the event. She has no soliloquy of deep thought or philosophical thought like Macbeth has. Her soliloquy is about her calling on the dark spirits to unsex her. Here, take my milk for gall. Rob me, take my... She doesn't actually say rob me of my femininity. She sacrifices her femininity. Everything that makes her feminine or female, she sacrifices that or offers it up for sacrifice in order to be powerful and strong enough to go through with this. We only learn about the decline of her mental health from others. We're brought into the scene by the doctor and the nurse, and they narrate the scene as she kind of mutters. So her decline is quite radical. She goes from being powerful and strong to wandering around at night with a candle, muttering to herself. So the juxtaposition between the Lady Macbeth at the beginning and at the end is huge. In her final scene, she has descended completely from this strong, powerful woman to a rambling mad woman, relentlessly washing her hands, trying to rid it of the bloodstains that she before thought a little water would wash them away. And she does say, "Consider it not so deeply foolish thought," almost that she's regretful, or that she's realised that her behaviour was ridiculous, naive, childish. She is haunted by the very imagined vision she taunted Macbeth for. So she's taunts Macbeth in the banquet scene. Is this like the dagger you said you saw before you, when he sees Banquo's ghost? And now she's haunted by the imagined blood on her hands that she can't wash away. In contrast, Macbeth is complicated. He's a deep thinker. Maybe his overthinking leads to paranoia. And this is shown in his response to the prophecies, that his thoughts instantly recognise this cannot be ill, cannot be good. And he goes backward and forward a little bit. He says he will, he won't, stars, hide your fires, the Prince of Cumberland, that is a step on which I must fall down or else or leap. I will not do it, like he's my kin, jump the life to come. And then she comes in, okay, I will do it. I think it would be naive of us to blame Lady Macbeth completely for his behaviour. But it is certainly worth noting the difference in not necessarily their intellect, but their emotional capacity, and certainly their ability for deep thinking, critical thought, and philosophical ideals. So Lady Macbeth does not have the same complexity. She never has her heart knock against her ribs against the use of nature. It's the opposite, actually. She gives out to him for bringing back the daggers. She's, I'll do it myself. Whereas he's horrified by some of the thoughts that he has, the images that he has. He's disturbed by it. It doesn't stop him, but he has them. Lady Macbeth is the more dominant of the two at the start of the play, for sure. The intensity of the murder and its consequences slowly begin to isolate her. And as an audience, we see her complete breakdown in her final scene, which is completely juxtaposed to how we originally meet her. And maybe that's part of the appeal of her character, that she has a complete decline. So guys, that sums up our little chat that we've had this past 2 weeks about Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. If there are any questions, just let me know. Thanks so much.